we are underestimating the degree of subjectivity about how we approach reality, even how we approach objective reality, because different people have different priors, which in turn could be this kind of murky function of all this anecdotal evidence and all our experiences.
Yeah.
And each of our priors will affect our decision about whether we believe a given result or not. And if we have disproportionately more power to make decisions about publication, this can have a tremendous impact on the actual empirical distribution of estimates that show up in the world.
Yeah.
And of course, in principle, that function, that murky function I told you about that leads us to have different priors could have no resemblance to reality, right?
Yeah.
It could be a very bad function.
Absolutely. So priors have a non-transparent way of showing up in the estimates, basically.
Yes. And it reminds me a little bit of discussions that we had in the 90s and the 2000s, which now are so ridiculous, right? Like, for instance, imagine if I were to say something now like, oh, I'm a racial blind person. I have no prejudice. Imagine if I make a statement like that. I think it's now obvious how ridiculous this statement is, right? Because there's no such a thing as being a racial blind person. Of course, there is such a thing as attempting to be racial blind, but there's no such a thing as actually being racial blind, or at least it's really, really hard to do so, right? And I think we have learned over the years that being truthful about that, being truthful about the fact that nobody can actually be racial blind, is a good thing, because it gives us a little bit of epistemic humility to understand that, hey, we could be biased about things and we don't know how, right? And I think it's something that we lack in academia a lot, in my opinion. There is a fundamental, like I said last time, pact of mediocrity we all have to think that the world is more objective than it actually is, and the way we approach reality is more objective than it actually is, when in fact it's quite subjective. It's certainly perhaps the least subjective way we came up with thus far, science is, versus alternative ways. I definitely tend to agree with that, but there is definitely enough subjectivity that we need to step back and understand, how do we make sense of reality, or even how do we make sense of objective reality once we acknowledge that arriving close to that objective reality are subjective.
I always think that unbiasedness and consistency and efficiency, the criteria which we teach about estimators as being the key desirable properties. I always think unbiasedness is an odd criteria, because unbiasedness is asking, suppose that the true parameter value is 8, on average, are you going to guess 8? So my analogy is, think about basketball players. Suppose you have NBA players and you're trying to guess how many points per game they're going to score. And you have LeBron James in your data, and unbiasedness as a criteria says that if somebody actually scores 30 points a game, you should on average guess that they score 30 points a game. So what happens in a typical game is that they score 30 points, and then so you have to guess that somebody like that guesses, if you see somebody score 30 points in a game, you have to guess that they score 30 points a game. That's the way to do it, to be fair to the Michael Jordans and LeBron Jameses of the world. But really, from the perspective of somebody who's trying to read information and make a sensible guess about the world, the sensible thing is not to guess if you see somebody score 30 points in a game, which is a lot of points. The sensible thing is to guess that probably, there's a chance that that person is Michael Jordan or LeBron James, but there aren't really people who are better than that at basketball. And there are lots of people who are worse at basketball than that who occasionally score 30 points in a game. So my best guess, if somebody scores 30 points in a game, my best guess is that that person doesn't actually average 30 points a game. My best guess is that person averages maybe, 20-something points a game. And if somebody scores 0 points in a game, my best guess is not that their season average is going to be 0 points per game. My best guess is going to be something higher than 0, because basically I should shrink the data in the direction of my prior belief. So, I mean, this was the whole, this was Stein's insight. But I think this hasn't been adopted really into practice that much. I think it winds up getting implicitly adopted in the way that people read papers. But in practice, when I see an effect estimate in a paper, that estimate combines the true value of the parameter plus some modeling error plus some sampling error. And adding in modeling error and sampling error tends to inflate the variance of estimates relative to the distribution of true effects. So if I collected all the things which people measured true effects for, there would be some distribution of the parameter values. And then when I look at the distribution of estimates, the distribution of estimates is wider than the distribution of true parameter values. So if I started off just saying, I'm estimating a parameter, so I should be drawing from this prior distribution, that is going to be a narrower distribution than the distribution of estimates. And what I should really be doing is shrinking. If I want to come up with an ideal estimate in the sense of like, this is my most accurate possible guess about what this true parameter is, I should be shrinking in the direction of the center of that distribution. And frankly, I think probably 0 is a pretty good number to shrink towards. So in general, this is, the fact that people have adopted unbiasedness rather than forecast unbiasedness as a criteria for estimators is a little funny to me. I think forecast unbiasedness, which is to say, like, if I label a treatment as having an effect of 3, it's not necessarily going to have literally an effect of 3, but on average, if I have many such treatments, on average, they really do have an effect of 3. Like, that's, from the perspective of doing a cost-benefit analysis or giving advice to a policymaker or something like that, you want forecast unbiasedness. You want to say, like, dear congressman, I've estimated that this thing has an effect of 3. I've estimated that these other things have an effect of 3. And so if you implement a bunch of these different things, on average, those are going to have an effect of 3. Now, some of these are going to wind up being a little bit more or less effective than you think. But if I want to say how much benefit am I getting per my dollar, that's my best sense in the sort of mean squared error, my best guess in the mean squared error minimizing sense.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So I think that is a reason to round estimates in the direction of 0. And I think I am also, in particular, I am very inclined.
Wait.
Okay.
Why 0? So why would your prior concentrate around 0? Like, because your prior could be different from mine, and maybe your prior is 0, my prior would be 3. Why isn't there an actual distribution of priors for us to shrink around?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that shrinking in the direction of some number different from 0 is a good idea. So you need to have a prior in any given context that you're studying. I agree that this is why it's sensible to think about what your prior is. And I think the way to think about your prior is to think about what do you think is the mechanism of action, and and how large are each of the effects along the steps that it takes to get from X to Y. So there's some papers where it's pretty straightforward that, like, there is this number of steps that it takes to get from X to Y it's like 1 step. So then it's a little harder to ballpark how large the effect might be. But even still, I mean, if you think about like the returns to schooling, there's a theoretical model which says, well, if people are going to decide whether to remain in school or not, how large does the benefit have to be to induce them to stay in school? And so that's a way of ballparking that the effect has got to be something on the order of magnitude of the rate of interest to induce people to wait an extra year to go into the labor market. That should be approximately what the return to schooling is. So when I read a returns to schooling paper, if I wrote the very first paper estimating the returns to schooling, I would think, well, here's my estimate that I've come up with, and here's my prior belief. And honestly, in a lot of situations, the prior is more informative than the estimate is. If you just think about like a back of the envelope model, I think oftentimes a back of the envelope model is more informative about how large an effect should be than the number that you come up with from.
So I guess the concern for cumulative knowledge and how we grow as a science is that our prior is a little bit more of a black box of how we aggregate other things and make sense of the world. And the way we go about estimating something is a little bit more explicit. Of course, as you know, there are several models that are not explicit at all, but they're certainly more explicit than our prior, which involves a lot of anecdotal evidence that we might have, a lot of different ideas we might have, which we never made it even conscious to us, let alone outside of us, right? So I wonder if this sort of relates to our previous conversation, right? Because I think an implication what you're saying is that this is one more reason why we are underestimating the degree of subjectivity about how we approach reality, even how we approach objective reality, because different people have different priors, which in turn could be this kind of murky function of all this anecdotal evidence and all our experiences.
Yeah.
And each of our priors will affect our decision about whether we believe a given result or not. And if we have disproportionately more power to make decisions about publication, either because we are referees or because we are a powerful person or even an editor, this can have a tremendous impact on the actual empirical distribution of estimates that show up in the world.
Yeah.
And of course, in principle, that function, that murky function I told you about that leads us to have different priors could have no resemblance to reality, right? It could be a very bad function.
Absolutely.
So
So I don't think the best practice is for people to impose an explicit prior necessarily. I think to me, the best practice would involve people thinking about what is a potentially plausible value of this parameter. Just sort of make some arguments about like, this is a number that I could make an argument for that seems kind of on the large side. Suppose I try to make a strong argument for like the largest value that I can imagine. This is my argument for that. And then this is my argument for the smallest parameter value that I can think about, and just sort of think about like, what does the evidence suggest among these different things? What are the sort of incidental lines of evidence? You know, what does OLS say, and what do we think about what direction OLS might be biased, etc. When we look at those sorts of lines of evidence, which are sort of medium lines of evidence, and in the sort of hierarchy of evidence that people have in the back of their mind for doing social science, I actually think collecting a number of medium lines of evidence is often pretty informative. So I think that's sort of step one of what I would want to see in social science is more of that, just thinking about, you know, why would we believe this or why would we believe something else? And then step two is reporting your results in a way which is more interpretable to somebody who wants to translate their prior into a posterior. So p-values I don't like because p-values are not quantitatively interpretable. You know, if I compare two hypotheses which were a priori equally likely, and one of them gets a p-value of 0.7 and the other gets a p-value of 0.2, the whole statistical significance machinery just tests those two hypotheses and says, well, I can't reject this one and I can't reject the other one. Well, but I update between those beliefs, right? The one which has p-value of 0.7, I should believe a little bit more than the one with a p-value of 0.2 now. And how much more should I believe it? You know, p-values don't tell you that. I can't just do the ratio of 0.7 to 0.2. That isn't the correct way of getting the correct updating factor. So, you know, Bayes factors help. My preferred version of Bayes factors is to take the likelihood of the data divided by the average likelihood of data you would expect if the null were true. Or if you invert that and you take the average likelihood given the null is true divided by the likelihood of this data given your particular null, then you get what you might think of as a naive Bayes factor of being like, so maybe let me talk about the first one. So if I put the likelihood of this data given this particular null divided by the average likelihood of data that you would see given whatever the truth is true, that's a way of saying, like, is this data unusually weird given if the null were true? Which is sort of the question that p-values are answering. P-values are trying to ask, would it be very unlikely to see data like this if the null were true? But p-values are asking it in an odd way because you're not evaluating the likelihood of the data itself. You're integrating over likelihoods of a bunch of different types of data which you didn't actually see, right? I mean, when I calculate the p-value for a t-statistic of 2, that's not just based on how likely it is to see a t-statistic of exactly 2. It's also based on how likely it is to see a t-statistic of -3 and of 75 and of 2 billion. So it doesn't really make sense to integrate the likelihoods over all of those possible scenarios. It makes more sense to focus on, like, how likely was it to see exactly the thing that I saw given some view of the world. So you should be looking at the likelihood, and having a statistic which is based on likelihoods allows you to compare and, like, calculate your Bayes factor for updating between two hypotheses, right? If you can say, like, well, the likelihood was twice as high under this hypothesis, under that hypothesis, well, then I should update my beliefs about the world accordingly. And p-values don't really let you do that. So the metric that I was talking about a second ago, where you say, okay, what's the likelihood of this data given the null divided by what's the average likelihood I would have expected to see just generically without knowing what the data is and anything like that. That's a straightforward way of saying, like, well, if that ratio is really small, then, like, yeah, this data is pretty weird. Like, this is the likelihood of this particular data is way smaller than what I would have expected to find. And like I say, if you take the ratio of it, you get this interpretation of, like, suppose I'm trying to think what would be my Bayes factor for updating between the truth and my null hypothesis. So, I don't necessarily know what the truth is. I don't necessarily know exactly what that factor would be, but without taking a stance on what the truth is, I can still say generically, it seems like, without taking a stance on what the truth is, I think on average I would be updating 3 to 1 towards the truth away from this particular null. So that suggests that this null is not very consistent with the data.
Yeah, I think this discussion is veering towards statistical decision theory, which is, so I think we do very little work in causal inference related to that, I think, because whenever we go and report some results, whatever information we report, the point estimate plus the p-value, or the point estimate plus the standard error, or just the confidence interval, whatever we do there, that's an information that a reader may pick up and may make decisions based on it. Yeah. And depending on the decisions and depending on the trade-off of, say, or error type 1 or error type 2 on the decision, or other kinds of mistakes one can make, like there's lots of asymmetries there, right? Like, for instance, sometimes calling a person guilty when the person is not guilty, I think we as society might feel much worse about that than the other way around, calling a person not guilty when the person is actually guilty. Or in different situations, you might actually have nonlinearity. And as we know, we estimate averages, and nonlinear function is by definition not a linear operator. Yeah. So what does it mean, log of an average, right? So I also find that to be particularly problematic because, like, for instance, let's go back to your example of return to schooling, right? Nobody really cares about maximizing the average return to schooling. Imagine, for instance, your return to schooling it's 5% for you, and it's 1% for me. And therefore, let's say the average will be 3%. Let's say that there are lots of people like you, lots of people like me, so that on average is 3%. The 5% for you may mean very different things in terms of utility for you than the 1% for me. So the way we would write utility function would be mostly something like, if you have a higher level of education and you probably get $10,000 more, but you already make $200,000 a year. So $10,000 more per year means very little. But maybe if I make $30,000 and I make only $2,000 more, maybe $2,000 more mean a lot more, given that I have only $30,000 a year. So in other words, the function is very nonlinear. The function that leads to people's actual outcomes that any society might care about, the notion of happiness or any motion like that. And this is going to be concerning, right? Because that average 3% means nothing, right? Like in principle, you could be thinking about just exaggerating, right? You don't even need to think about nonlinearities like the one I just said. But imagine, for instance, the kinds of people that have a return to be 5%, like you are the kind of person that is flat in terms of your happiness, in terms of money. You are an anxious kind of person that doesn't matter how much money you make, you're always going to be unhappy. And the kinds of people that make 1% more are the kinds of people that are very elastic in terms of happiness. 1% makes them ecstatic, very happy. So in that scenario, if you really think in terms of decision, you might want to target the people that have 1% returns, instead of targeting the people that have 5% returns. Yeah. And of course, the average is telling us nothing about that. In fact, you might argue that utility as a whole, because it's an ordinal concept, it's not a cardinal concept, there's no way to compare your utility with my utility to make any objective statement later on. So you might actually make the argument that if you go to utility, it's non-parametrically not identifiable. You just do not know which, if you have two policies, one that has 3% average returns and another that have a 10% average return, you really cannot say that one policy is going to be better than the other if you are utilitarian, right? You really can't say that, because it's possible that the 10% one gets a completely different distribution than the 3% one. And non-parametrically speaking,
I would say that it seems reasonable to imagine that probably the thing which, unless there's essentially, you'd need to have a correlation between who benefits and how much they stand to, how much their utility improves.
And the reason you are saying this is that effectively what you have here is that you have a prior in this functional space.
Exactly. Yeah.
That connects across utilities, a utility of the person I versus utility of the person J, and you have a prior about what constitute functions that are more likely to happen in the world. Yeah. And that's why you think that, come on, Greg, that thing that you just said is a stretch, which I agree. I think it makes sense. But that's what it means also, what economists would call, that's non-parametrically not identifiable, right? Because it's effectively you need to impose some kind of restrictions that connect the utility of person I has to be sort of the same function, of a similar function, than the utility of person J, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is like
there
in
is
principle,
a probability of reversal. Basically, like on average, my guess is that probably the thing which has the 10% return is better than the thing with the 3% return, but the probability that it's better is not 100%, even if I know for sure what the two returns are.
That is correct. But you know another way of solving the problem? Another way of solving the problem is to assume it away by assuming constant returns, which is, as you know, this is exactly what is done in standard textbook econometrics, even in PhD level, which is, let's not talk about heterogeneous effects. Let's just assume homogeneous effects, because then everything collapses, and then you can actually aggregate everything, right? Because whatever you estimate, the average, means this is the same for every individual. And then you don't need to worry about that. But I find this assumption to be particularly troublesome because even though, of course, these people are very careful people, they are usually thinking at that just from didactic purposes. But I don't think the typical user of those textbooks, they truly appreciate how much heterogeneity is in the world and how much there is little for us to say about policy once you take heterogeneity seriously. Because I really have a hard time thinking about any decision that anybody would make in their life from reading a paper that would involve a linear operator of whatever they read. Like, for instance, if I want to read a paper in health to make a decision about my own health or about my son's health, I'll certainly not look at the average estimate, right? I would probably pay attention to a very weird kind of function of whatever I read in the paper. If I am a policymaker reading the literature return to schooling, or a given paper return to schooling, and I would like to reduce inequality somehow, I would put much more attention on somebody who has currently low education and much less attention to return to schooling to somebody who currently has higher education. You need to actually put different weights, and this will lead to a nonlinear function. And
So
I really have a hard time
advice.
understanding about any particular decision making that one would do after reading a paper that was not involve some kind of manipulation of the point estimate in a way that it would only make sense, really, the result of that paper will only make sense under constant returns to schooling or constant effects. That's my claim.
So what do you think is more important? So there are two different ways that one could deal with heterogeneity. One is to estimate sort of conditional average treatment effects or something along those lines. Or there's also, there's a little bit of new literature, like there's this paper, Super Compliers, by John Pei and Pauline Lung and a couple other people, about how you can estimate the characteristics of beneficiaries. You can get the distribution of characteristics of beneficiaries from some treatment. So, you could do something like that where you characterize in terms of observed characteristics, which would be a sort of maybe a sensible response to what you're talking about if that heterogeneity mapped into observed characteristics in some way. Or you could talk about saying that rather than identifying the mean, I'm going to study the effects of this policy on the variance of the outcome or the third moment or something like that. Which of those do you think is more important? Which would you most like to see?
So I think it's an interesting avenue we're going to. I would say that this is a little bit of a new pose question because, so for instance, I would like diversity in the way to approach this. Like, for instance, so going after heterogeneous treatment effects, like based on covariates, like you're saying, would be very helpful, but then you would it potentially lead to issues that you mentioned last time related to problems of precision. They can become really a major issue there.
Yeah.
The reason why I think it's a little bit of a new conceived question, the way you posed, is that a lot of the idea of super compliers involve some form of IV, some form of first stage going on there. And in principle, OLS does not have that kind of additional line of issue, which IVs do. And the reason I'm talking about this is that in IVs specifically, you have this additional issue, and that's why the idea of super complier could be helpful here to also, because one key issue that people don't talk much about IVs is that, of course, everybody knows that IVs identify effects only among compliers, but what or at least I don't see much discussed in textbooks. And because most people read textbooks before they use those stuff, I don't think people know enough about this. Of course, economic teachers know very well about this, but most users do not know very well about this, is that, like you said, yes, they are compliers, but it's an unknown group of the population, the people that are the source of variation. It's an unknown group of the population. And of course, you can use ideas to figure out how you can, in terms of observables, what are the kinds of people that are compliers, what are the kinds of people that are always takers, never takers, based on issues of, like, based on the validity assumption of the IV or random assignment, things like that. You can actually make assumptions to figure this out, which is related to your point. So I find that all those things are very useful to kind of almost like to map the extent to which there is a lot of heterogeneity and the extent to which the kinds of effect that you're getting come from a given subgroup of the population. All those things are very helpful, and ideally you would like to figure out ways of reporting them in the paper as much as possible, because this goes back to the idea that we discussed last time. I am particularly keen on figuring out ways of not suppressing these kinds of data, so that in the future, different technologies that can aggregate data and kind of map the full extent of heterogeneous effects across papers, they can actually use these as data points for them to, in the future, like something like an AI in the future could actually do some form of weird kind of meta-analysis if they had enough information, enough data points, enough information also about which kind of subgroup or which kind of source of variation is identifying a given effect. I find everything you said very relevant. I just don't know if this will be enough, in part because of what we discussed last time, because the priors of editors, the priors of referees, and the fact that we have enough epistemic gatekeeping is restricting also the data sets that we can train on. And I am concerned about whether there is important aspects of the truth that we cannot perceive, they cannot be, that cannot percolate academia, they cannot percolate the data sets that we observe. By data set, I mean the point estimates that we observe, in part because there's some enough filtering from people that have perhaps very good priors, but they are some priors. They're not necessarily the only possible reasonable priors one can have.
The priors have a non-transparent way of showing up in the estimates, basically.
Yes. Yep. And it reminds me a little bit of discussions that we had in the 90s and the 2000s, which now are so ridiculous, right? Like, for instance, if you speak to people now about, imagine if I were to say something now like, oh, I'm a racial blind person, I have no prejudice. Imagine if I make a statement like that. I think it's now obvious how ridiculous this statement is, right? Because there's no such a thing as being a racial blind person. Of course, there is such a thing as attempting to be racial blind, but there's no such a thing as actually being racial blind, or at least it's really, really hard to do so, right? And I think we have learned over the years that being truthful about that, being truthful about the fact that nobody can actually be racial blind, is a good thing, because it gives us a little bit of epistemic humility and to understand that, hey, we could be biased about things and we don't know how, right? And I think it's something that we lack in academia a lot, in my opinion. There is a fundamental, like I said last time, pact of mediocrity we all have to think that the world is more objective than it actually is, and the way we approach reality is more objective than it actually is, when in fact it's quite subjective. It's certainly perhaps the least subjective way we came up with thus far, science is, versus alternative ways. I I definitely tend to agree with that. But there is definitely enough subjectivity that we need to step back and understand how do we make sense of reality, or even how do we make sense of objective reality once we acknowledge that arriving close to that objective reality are subjective. This is almost similar to the whole revolution of psychology, right? Like all these biases that we all have, now it's very helpful for us to understand that we all have biases in the way we perceive things, and acknowledging the fact that we have these biases are helpful for us to understand reality. And I don't think what I'm trying to make is this meta point about academia overall, which is we are operating a world as if we're all racial blind, or at least as if, like, when I wear the hat of a really good scientist, I am racial blind. I'm not talking about racial blind. You know what I mean? I'm like completely, like I'm the Karl Popper, the ideal Karl Popper investigator, right? Which is, I don't think is scalable at all, because it's not necessarily. It's something that could happen by chance. Maybe at a given point in my lifetime, I may have been such a person like that in a given specific point, but most of the time I'm not, and most of the time nobody is. And I think it's important for us to step back and how do we devise a system in academia that acknowledges the fact that nobody is such a perfect person. Even the person who is trying their best is not.
Yeah, I agree. I want to come back to an unrelated point to what you were just talking about, where you were talking earlier about IV versus OLS. I don't see much of a distinction between IV and OLS, except for the fact that IV is basically, it's as if you're working with a far smaller sample size. You've thrown away most of your data. But the econometrics of IV could be implemented using OLS, and the econometrics of OLS could be implemented using IV. Obviously, there's the sort of, there's the minor complication of having an estimated regressor. But if I think of OLS as being an IV, where my IV is just take my treatment and residualize it on controls, and that's my IV for treatment, that's the same thing as your OLS estimate that you're going to get, and vice versa.
No, I think I understand. So as always, we can always understand X prime X inverse as a specific form of IV where X equals Z, right? I get it. I definitely understand your point. I would say that two things happen though. When you don't use 100% of the sample as a source of variation, two things happen. One is that, like you said, you may have issues of precision, issues of the fact that you don't have full first stage. That's the point that you alluded to. Yep. But I think the second part, which I think is underappreciated, is the fact that the moment you are not using some part of that variation, that is specific part of the variation you're not using, those particular observations you're not using, they are unknown. As in, you do not know the specific observations you are not using for the variation once you use an IV, because by definition you're not using 100% of the variation. So that's why the second point you made,
the characteristics of compliers, but you don't know their exact identities.
But you know only the observer characteristics of compliers, you see? So based on the idea of super compliance, based on the ideas you were talking about before, you will only understand the observable characteristics of that with a method like that. And that, I think, you don't know the specific eyes, the specific observations that happen to be a complier versus the specific observations that happen to be on honest takers or never taker. Yeah. And besides, you make the assumption that there are no defiers. So
I think as a researcher, like, even if I knew precisely which observation was which, I mean, I guess in some cases, like if an observation is a state, then I have a theory of what each observation looks like. If my observations are individuals, then like,
no.
I know this is Ralph Schnuckendruber.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. It's just that the way I would say it would be, I would say that the moment you are not using 100% of the variation, and it's unknown which of the observations you're not using, I think it's fair to say that there's one further degree of ambiguity going on here.
Yep.
I often find that sometimes I'm actually curious. I know I'm going to try to make a meta point here, but this relates also to this idea of meme from Richard Dawkins. Like, why some ideas, they tend to percolate more than other ideas, right? So I often find that part of the reason why the idea of constant treatment effects, they tend to be particularly well accepted in our profession, is that there are lots of things that make it easier for us to get our jobs, to get published and things like that. Like all those ideas I told you about, like we are all pretending that the decision maker can just get our paper and add a nonlinear function to it and make sense of the world, right? If there's constant treatment effects, which is, of course, as you and I probably agree, this is ludicrous. But there's another thing that I think is kind of self-serving for us. I don't know if you have seen, but I have this new paper where I discuss violations of SUTVA, the stable unit treatment value assumption. Mm-hmm. So the title of the paper is Inference with Aggregated Treatment Effects or something like that. I forgot the name of the title of the paper. So imagine if you have a treatment variable that is somewhat aggregated. Like, for instance, mm-hmm. Most of my papers on time use, I have to do such a thing. Like, for instance, whenever I estimate what is the causal effect of enrichment activities, I don't mean enrichment activities, right? Some enrichment activities could be like whenever the treatment variable is hours spent on enrichment activities, I'm adding up playing the piano, I'm adding up playing sports, I'm adding up several different kinds of enrichment activities, right? Whenever I estimate in another paper the causal effect of crime, sometimes I'm talking about certain kinds of crime versus other kinds of crimes and so on, right? So the problem about that is that whenever we write potential outcomes in causal inference, we're essentially stating that the yi of d, right, it is well defined. Let's say that, let's look at one person I, me. The y, the outcome I would get if I spend 2 hours of enrichment activities is a well-defined value there, irrespective of whether I spend 1 hour playing the piano and 1 hour playing soccer versus 2 hours playing piano, right?
I think, yeah. So the way that I would conceptualize that is that, like, I have to imagine that if I made this person do 2 hours, they would spend their time in some particular way. But the mechanism by which you make people spend 2 hours is going to cause some people to, or maybe could cause the same person to spend 2 hours playing the piano if you did it one way, or if you did it a different way, you would force them to spend 2 hours playing sports. And so therefore, for somebody who didn't in fact spend 2 hours doing enrichment activities, I completely agree, that potential outcome is not necessarily well defined, or people like to glaze over any complexities with how that might be defined. Same thing with like returns to schooling. Like, for people who didn't go to school for that long, where would they go to college?
Exactly.
Like, which college would they go to?
That is exactly right.
Do go to college?
Talk exactly about that.
What would they do if they dropped out of high school? Are you talking about that they're dropping out of high school and they hang out at home? Like, what exactly? I mean, it's a little easier to, imagine that in the sense that it's like, suppose I pass a law saying Joe can't go to high school, everybody else is allowed to. Then, like, there's something
that is right. The only thing you got the intuition. The only thing I would modify, just to be a little bit more precise, is that let's not talk about different people here. Let's talk about the exact same person, because that's helpful here, because whenever we think about heterogeneous effects, we always have in mind across different people. But now we're talking about the same person. Like, for instance, if I go to college, when we talk about return to school, return to college, let's say, what is the return of Greg going to college? The return of Greg going to college will be different if Greg goes to Harvard versus if Greg goes to a community college, And whenever we write a potential outcome model there, we are pretending that there is only one feature of treatment that we can call off college, which is college, regardless of whether it's Harvard or whether it's a community college. I'm exaggerating, but of course, a lot of empirical people are very aware of this, and they try to make sense of this, but there's no, as far as we knew, there was no econometrics of it. That's what we wrote the paper, right? To add language and try to make sense of this more formally. But the key issue that shows up there is that there's going to be a fundamental different notion of external validity going on here, right? Which is now not an external validity across people, but within person across different features of a treatment. Yep. Right? And here's my claim. And this is something that is more speculative, but I think this is actually a real issue for us right now in science. I think this generates a lot of issues in terms of comparing results across papers in ways that we don't yet have a good language for, because when you, like a classic issue, you see situations like the immigration literature, where even the debate between Borjas and Card, right? Let's say that for the sake of argument, all the results are valid. All the identification strategies out there are valid in those two lines of work. And they obviously get very different point estimates. And of course, there's a lot that we know that has to do with heterogeneous effects. Like you're using different source of variation there. But I think part of the issue here is that there's something else underneath in their respective potential outcome assumption there, that what they mean by an immigration shock is very different. And of course, we call immigration shock because of the need for us to compress the meaning of things so that we can talk to each other. But then in doing this compression, they are pretending they are in the same literature, when in fact they may not be quite in the same literature, because an immigration shock in Mario Boatleaf's paper will be a very different kind of immigration shock, because the overall distribution of people that come in Miami will be very different from the overall distribution of people in Borja's work, but not necessarily in the dimensions that we observe, which might be whether you have low education or high education, whether you are Cuban or not in the case of Mary Boatleaf, but whether you have low education and high degree of assimilation, or whether you have low education and you are in a context where a lot of people can help you assimilate more or less in the new city. So this is sort of related. We never discussed this last time, because this is sort of related to this IID assumption that we tend to make when we do sort of like a meta-analysis. Let's say that you oftentimes in health, you see a lot of that, not health economics, but in general in health, you see like 100 different studies on the same topic. And it looks like you're just talking about different people, but doing the exact same treatment intervention. But it's not quite true that it's the same treatment intervention. One is being done at Princeton University, the other is being done at MIT. The person who is implementing the treatment at MIT is a different person than the person who is implementing in Princeton. And effectively, to the extent that any way that one can implement things can have any impact on the actual outcome, the SUTVA assumption at this level that is aggregated, that is compressed for us all to pretend that all this work is in the same literature, they are not quite in the same literature. And whenever we make this IID assumption, I think it's almost like we want to, this goes back to Inbin's recent work on clustering, right? You almost want to cluster the standard errors on the treatment decision, on the treatment dimension. Yeah. There are some certain treatments that are more similar than others in that sense. But because we make the SUTVA assumption, we kind of gloss over all this line of heterogeneity.
Let me suggest an alternative way of phrasing what you're describing. So in psychology, people worry a lot about construct validity, the idea that I've labeled something in a particular way, and I have some, for instance, survey that I've given out to try to measure who has depression or who has high intelligence or whatever. And you need to argue that the label that you apply to the number you've come up with is a reasonable label to apply to that. I think economics, construct validity is a relatively uncommon thing for people to worry about. I think people apply labels relatively readily, and there's not a lot of pushback about the label that you choose to apply to some particular feature of your data. And both what you're talking about in terms of SUTVA, where you're saying, well, if a potential outcome could be defined in multiple different ways, then what exactly is the treatment here? That's in some sense a statement that the label that you've applied for what the treatment is doesn't map exclusively to one particular way of defining that treatment. So there are multiple definitions which could all have the same label applied to them. So there's sort of an issue of not a one-to-one mapping between the label and the definition of terms. And I think that's actually related to the concerns about late not equaling 8 as well, in the sense that when I talk about like this particular thing that I saw, I'm claiming it's representative of a broader category. So I got this particular variation in treatment, and I'm going to make the claim that that's representative of a broader category of things which happen when this occurs. I think those are all sort of a little bit the same thing of people apply labels, and labels implicitly subsume larger groups of treatments or larger groups of people, etc. And the question is, when you apply that label, you're changing what you're doing in some way. Sometimes you're compressing information, sometimes you're expanding the implications of what you're saying, but you're changing the implications of what you're doing. And those steps tend to get relatively less criticism in economics than the aspects of a paper related to correlation is not causation, etc. And I think part of why it gets less criticism is, again, because it's not an all or nothing thing. There are always issues. There's no way you can write a paper where you don't have to worry about external validity a little bit. But internal validity, usually, like, I can argue that I did literal random assignment, and that makes it so that there's literally exactly zero problem of endogeneity in, when we worry about, like, was there selection into treatment on the basis of potential outcomes? Like, I can literally eliminate that problem, and that makes it so that the referee has to be happy that I've addressed this point. But when I'm thinking about issues of what labels did I apply to something, usually it's pretty rare that there's going to be a case where I can label something in a way which is completely satisfactory to everyone. And so if I push back about labeling, that winds up being interpreted as being a nitpicky criticism. I think senior referees are more likely to care about that stuff, though. And I suspect that that's because most people, through experience in the profession, learn that that matters. In the same way that I think senior referees are also more likely to worry about measurement error, which is kind of the same thing, that you're applying a label to a variable, but it's not quite the label that you thought it was. I think people somehow figure this out over the course of working in the profession. To a certain extent, at least sensible, wise people seem to figure out that these are issues. And I guess the question is, how would you get younger people to process that this is there? Or even, again, it may even be that senior people who've been doing this for a while realize that this is a problem, but maybe they don't realize how much of a problem it is. Because there's, as you talked about, when you do meta-analyses, there's often a lot of variation in estimates from paper to paper. And some of that could be coding errors. Some of it could be that the identifying assumptions are wrong, but I think a lot of it is just, we're categorizing things together which don't really quite belong in the same category.
I agree. I think this is I would argue that over and above all the issues that we discussed last time,
Yeah.
related to the replication crisis that we have in, say, psychology, I think there's one more dimension going on here, is that if we were to solve all problems that we discussed last time,
Yeah.
we will still have the issue that's what I meant by self-serving bias last time, is that we need to create a compressed language for us to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And in that compressed language, there will be blind spots that will make my paper and your paper seemingly talk to each other, when in fact there is an aspect to which they do not talk to each other. And that's how we get jobs, because somebody has to read my paper, somebody has to read your paper. If I were to ask the question in terms of what is the causal effect of enrichment activities, like I wrote in that paper, let's say that I only get a specific kind of variation, and I ask the actual question that perhaps my variation would give, which would be, what is the causal effect of a boy who is 13 years old spending 1 additional hour on piano lessons on Friday while paying very little attention? If I go and ask this specific causal question, people are going to say, who cares? I do not know why that information is relevant at all.
Yeah.
But effectively, that specific variation that might identify my effect might be that one. And that the fact that I compress the language is very self-serving, right? Because it makes everybody wants to read my paper now, because enrichment activity, somebody who reads the paper might be thinking not about piano lessons or about a boy doing things on Friday, but rather some completely different form of enrichment activity. And they may think that my estimate may inform their decision in some important way, when in fact it doesn't. Yeah. So I think this is problematic, in particular also because, and this goes back to what you're saying, I think empirical people might get a good sense of things like that. And yet, as far as we know, and we did the literature review to study this when we wrote the paper, we do not have a well-formed theory of causal inference under no SUTVA. So, like, if you don't have SUTVA at that level, what do you do, right? Like, what do you do next? Do we just avoid the causal question, or do we still have a causal effect, perhaps not as meaningful as you would like, but still a meaningful, in some way, a meaningful causal effect under no SUTVA? Because SUTVA is such an axiom in causal inference that we just take it for granted. But the problem is that when you ex post define what the aggregated treatment is, like in the case of time use is a very good example, because you actually do observe the piano lessons. You actually do observe all those things. And yet you need to make sense of things. Sometimes you need to aggregate things because of precision reasons. Sometimes you need to aggregate things because you want to streamline your narrative of your paper. Sometimes you want to do that because otherwise nobody's interested. Like I said before, the self-serving part. Whatever reason, people tend to aggregate. I mean, imagine if 100% of the literature returns to schooling, they talk about years of schooling or college experience. They don't talk about the specifics of that in the title of their paper, right? The specifics of the college. I mean, some, like, for instance, in many countries, if you take, like in many countries, a major like economics takes 4 years in college, and another major like engineering takes 5 years. So if you go the 4th to 5th years in schooling, it really means a completely different compositional effect.
Yeah.
And we're not discussing that at all, because effectively, if you are to formally discuss that, you have to talk about the fact that whenever you think about counterfactually, a person, I, going from 4 years of college to 5 years of college, it really does not mean a fifth year of economics. It means getting out of college major in economics and getting in an engineering major. So it's actually, it requires some form of replacement of college majors. So if we believe that for whatever reason economics has a higher return to schooling than engineering, then effectively you will see a negative weight problem, right? Effectively, you see a lower returns to schooling from that fifth year, not because 1 year of schooling actually is worse, but rather because that person went down in economics and went up in engineering. So in principle, both returns to economics and returns to engineering could have positive effects, could be positive returns. But because returns to economics is higher than returns to engineering, you have a negative overall effect. That's the definition of negative weights, right? Yeah. You have the sub-treatments, this treatment that we define sub-treatment in that paper, the treatments at this true level of the SUTVA, the real SUTVA, could be all positive, and yet the overall effect you estimate could be negative. If you have such replacement like that. So I'm still crawling on this. I don't understand truly what can be done about this. But I think sometimes just the awareness of that and providing more language about that to truly convey the degree of uncertainty when you report a result and the degree to which you cannot perhaps truly understand the results from Card as a full rejection of the results from Borjas, or the results from Borjas as a true rejection from the results of Card. Because sometimes I worry that there's an unusual amount of energy trying to solve cognitive dissonances, like the results from Borjas in immigration are different from the results of Card in immigration, so either one of them must be wrong or something like that. No, it's entirely plausible that both of them are right, but right in getting their own different kinds of estimates, and they are talking about different literatures when they're thinking they're talking about the same literature when in fact they're talking about different literatures. It's just that we do not have enough scale of interest, perhaps, to get interested in different literatures among those two, because we all compress and think that this is the same literature.
Let me suggest that there's another issue with labels, which is that there are things which we might actually potentially group together, but we don't even have a name for. So when I think about, like, people are trying to understand why there's been a fertility decline in, let's say, the US in the last few years. Now, of course, there's one explanation for that is you say, well, as countries get richer, they tend to have fertility declines. But, it's not like the US has had fertility declines exactly linearly with GDP growth. So why was there a relatively sudden decline after, 2008 or so that sort of, fertility jumped down and has been persistently lower? And I think the literature, when you look at papers which are trying to study that, they try to go for labels which are relatively, there's certain things which are easier to label precisely to solve the problem that we're talking about. You can say things like, is it iPhones? So there it's easier to construct, like, what's the counterfactual by saying, like, well, suppose that nobody had ever built the iPhone. Suppose that, those guys had all gotten really lazy at their job and they never went about building the phones, and they just drew their paychecks. And so then we could imagine a world where iPhones never came along, and you say, well, how different would fertility be without iPhones? I think probably the stuff which matters is really something which I would call more just vibes. Somehow the culture changed in this particular way, and when you see it, you know it. Like, and just like Justice Potter said about pornography, I know it when I see it, but I don't know what label to apply to that aspect of culture. I guess I could call it, placing a lower emphasis on having kids, that's a little bit tautological, that obviously the effect of placing a lower emphasis on having kids is to have fewer kids. But there are certain distractions of life or placing an emphasis on things other than that, which naturally lead people to have fewer kids. And I don't know exactly, I don't know what label to apply to that stuff. I don't know exactly what things, you wouldn't be able to come up with a label which would necessarily cleanly label things as belonging to this phenomenon or not belonging to this phenomenon without, again, having to define the phenomenon in a completely tautological way where you say, oh, well, whatever the features of culture are which make people less inclined to have kids, those belong in my category. Well, obviously that has the effect. But I think that's an issue because then people don't work on those topics. You can't
I
really
agree.
write a paper if you can't define the treatment in an intelligent way. And yet those things where you can't define the treatment, I think those matter a lot for a lot of different things.
I agree. So, as you know, I work a lot with social norms, and that is a tremendous problem there because social norms are fairly subjective. And I would like to use this word because I think this goes back to what we were discussing before. I think the fact that certain variables are hard to define in an objective way, like an iPhone is very easy to define in an objective way, like this vibe that you're talking about, or social norms or expectations for that matter, are very hard to define in an objective way. It's almost like a kind of axiom that you need to take for granted before you even write your paper, that some people may just be a no-go from the beginning of your paper. So the return to writing such a paper could be low ex ante just because people might not believe in that axiom. I find that we are losing so much in terms of the ability to get closer to the truth, in part because we are under this illusion that the world is more objective than it actually is. If we were under a more accurate understanding of the world, that the world is fairly subjective. And again, when I say the world is fairly subjective, I don't mean reality is subjective, but rather the way to approach reality is subjective, right? Like, for instance,
Reality is objective, but reality is far too complex to have any particular compression of reality exactly capture reality. And
yeah,
so simply, if two different people start with two different priors, they're going to wind up with different posteriors.
yeah. So yeah, it's not exactly. It's not about only incomplete information, which is the first statement you made. It's about the fact that information is fairly decentralized and non-nested. So my information is different from yours because
Yeah.
I have some experience that you don't. You have some experience that I don't. And the moment you have a more centralized approach to do epistemic gatekeeping, where it goes through editors, it goes through referees and things like that, that's the moment when there is going to be some kind of filtering based on a specific network of priors, let's say.
Yeah.
And that is really concerning for me, I think. Again, I understand the reason why epistemic gatekeeping exists. There's a reason. It's a good thing. But there is a trade-off that people do not appreciate, I think. And now, this goes back to what you're saying, right? Because there are certain questions we are not asking right now and people that are smart people in academia, people that are working in several fields, like in sociology, in economics, in physics for that matter, in all fields, they are not really spending their energy enough on important questions because those important questions cannot be published. And the current reward system that we have is mostly depending on this epistemic gatekeeping, depending on publication and peer reviews and so on. That's in part why I came up with this podcast, because I do not think that I was particularly worried, for instance, about questions that are multidisciplinary, right? There are certain questions that are multidisciplinary where you can either enter in an axiom of economics and talk about it, or you can enter the axiom of sociology and talk about it, or the axiom of computer science and talk about it. You cannot really navigate seamlessly across this set of axioms to make sense of things, because you cannot publish such work. If I go and write a multidisciplinary paper, there's going to be at least one referee for each of those fields, and each of those referees are going to hate the part that is not related to their field. There's no way of me ever publishing such a paper. And of course, ex ante at least, there's no incentive for me to even exert effort to writing such a paper, or to even thinking more seriously about such a paper. So thankfully, of course, you have fields like economics, where academics are sufficiently well paid, and you have tenure systems like that, where people are sufficiently feel safe enough in their jobs, and we make enough money to survive and have a good life, where it becomes a luxury good for you and I to talk about things that we're talking about. We make no money out of situations like that. I'm having this conversation, right? We're just talking because we're friends and we like to talk about things.
Oh, you're not paying me. Okay, well then the podcast.
Yeah. well, I only decided to set up this podcast when I made sure that I could set up a rule where I have genuinely value out of having conversations. That's why I try to invite people that I like and I like having conversations with, instead of necessarily because I do not want to set up things so that I require some form of outcome, like money or anything like that, because otherwise it will affect my capability of saying what I really think is the true blind spot, which is not necessarily what people want to hear, unfortunately. Currently not. Anyway, my claim here is that I think in the case of SUTVA and in case of these issues that we're talking about, I think there's a fundamental, this goes back to even Einstein, I don't know if Einstein actually said that, but it's certainly attributed, that quote is attributed to Einstein, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts, right? This is essentially this idea that we tend to pay a lot more attention on what is quantifiable, what is more objective, but that may not be what matters, right? And this relates to the idea of that you're saying about the vibes. That is really hard to say. Yeah. The economics of vibes, right? You don't write such a paper. You can write papers in theory about that. And I think, honestly, this is one of the things I always talk here in my department about this. I find that there's a fundamental underappreciation of economic theory about that. I think economic theory is extremely helpful for us to make progress on things that are not quite yet precise enough to be seen as objective. I think there's a lot of room in economics, in economic theory, to make sense of things inside axiomatic sets that are not yet fully agreed on. I love that. It's almost like a. I know.
To give an example, I'm not sure I see exactly how theory would accommodate this. Aside from sort of like defining a residual in a utility function in a particular way or something like that. How would theory make? So
I think empirical work, we do not necessarily choose our axioms, right? We have a data set. The only available data set is the one that is we already have access to. Yep. And then there's a lot of axioms that are already there, as in the variable that you observe is a given one. So we cannot really talk about what if I observe this other variable instead. Like, it's really hard to do this kind of stuff. So I think in economic theory, we have a little bit more leeway to define the sandbox in a different way. Yeah. Define your sandbox, define your axiomatic set in a different way, which allow us to make precise statements inside alternative universes, alternative scenarios. Okay, I think that is particularly helpful to discipline our thoughts in worlds, to have a more fluid kind of models, more fluid kinds of axioms. Because I think that oftentimes in empirical work, we take a lot of things for granted because we don't discuss what would have happened if the data set was different, right? Because it's sort of like it doesn't make sense for us to think too much about that. But in economic theory, we do a little bit more of that. I think I think this is valuable exercise. And inside economics, you see more theoretical fields like econometrics doing that. Like when you see the econometrics of non-parametrics, for instance, was created. The statistics of non-parametrics was mostly done outside of econometrics, it turns out. It was done way before we had computers to do things like that. But now we are all enjoying the fact that that theory happened 20 years before the computers, now that we have good computers to do so. So I think that's a useful thing. And I think economic theory is sort of like that in the same way. I find it is fundamentally underappreciated.
I appreciated your use of the word enjoying. I'm imagining somebody, you know, at the end of a long day, they go home, you know, they have a nice meal, they eat their cheeseburger, have a beer, and like fire up El Pali and Stata. Yeah.
But it is true, right? Like we get a lot of, we have a lot of better understanding of the world. And if there was no such this basic science that was created 20 years before,
yeah, absolutely,
with no understanding about how fast computers will be in the future, in principle.
And it's like neural networks were the same thing, where like, you know,
yeah, exactly,
they were invented long before there was the computing capacity.
And I would argue that is what we're talking about here is much more general, right? It's a fundamental way of approaching precision. If you think about it, like, what is the role of art in the world? If you look at, like, I just came from Egypt, so I'm thinking quite a bit about that, right? But there are certain ideas that may have happened even 4,500 years ago, or in the case of Egypt, like as early as 6,000 years ago, or something like that, where those ideas were not well formed at that time. But there's something very nice about certain forms of art where you can convey things in a fundamentally ambiguous way.
Yes.
That can it's almost like create a little bit of building block for people to have more precise understanding of the world, and yet it's not yet precise. Like, for instance, if you and I hear the same song, it may lead me to have some form of feeling that is very different from your feeling, which is weird, right? It's very ambiguous that way. And yet somehow that music touches me in a very weird way. It touches you in a very different way. But lots of ideas, I would say a lot of the ideas got formed like that until we became sufficiently cohesive so that we can grasp it. And then we start writing more precise statements about those ideas. And eventually it might turn out to be papers and things like that. But I find that the approach to understanding the world comes from several different forms of art and language before it shows up, so that people like you and I start nerding out and making more sense of things. And I think economic theory is very helpful as a later stage on that. I'm not saying that economic theory is art, but it's a much later stage to make sense of the world, so that we actually have a better, like, I still think, for instance, the overall value of being an economist has a lot to do with our first year of PhD, which has a lot in turn to do with taking economic theory and macroeconomic theory and things like that, and econometrics for sure, in first year. It has a lot to do with this basic language that we all have formulated among ourselves.
So I think the idea that art is evocative, I think that sort of gets to the point about stuff which is hard to put labels on that I was making earlier. I think the fact that, like, I listen to a song and that song makes me feel nostalgic. There's nothing intrinsic about certain wavelengths of sound. There's nothing intrinsically nostalgic about it. It's just that our brain is a weird function where you put in one input and the output is something which seems virtually unrelated to that.
That's right.
Yet, nonetheless, there's sort of a predictable pattern based on the fact that people are all pretty similar to each other. That, like, most people will hear one song and will hear it as being like kind of melancholy or maybe spooky or something like that. And it's not that there's anything intrinsic about augmented chords which makes them spooky. There's nothing scary about,
That's right.
dividing
That's
an
right.
octave into, into even intervals, but for whatever reason, people interpret it that way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of human behavior can be explained by basically idiosyncratic features of the way our brains are designed, which are hard to articulate clearly because there isn't a direct, obvious connection between the input and the output. You have to like have an extremely complex understanding of the way that the brain works before you can explain all the links which connect them. Uh, and and so there's not a simple way of explaining why it is that like this particular Seinfeld made people change this about their lives. Well, it's hard to put a label on exactly what is the mechanism of action there, and yet nonetheless the thing is real.
Yeah, yeah. Think about you yourself, David. So because you were my PhD student, I remember exactly how you came up with some of your ideas that led to the PhD dissertation. So think about the first times you mentioned those ideas of yours to me.
Yeah.
They were ill-posed, right? They were just not precise enough the first
Yeah.
times. But then you start speaking and you start hearing yourself, you start getting some feedback from me or other people, and you start making it more precise, those ideas. And at some point you realize, hey, that's an idea here. That's an idea. That's a new idea here. So it's almost like I've been recently meditating over that. Like literally when I'm meditating and I'm starting to think when I first grasp the notion that this is a new idea, I realized that first moment, let's say that first millisecond where you had that idea, it feels to me like a subjective experience. It feels like a subjective experience because I did not get, like right now, right there, right? Like let's say that you were telling me one idea of yours, there's going to be your idea, right? That's your original idea. There is the moment there that you, David, are the only person who knows that idea. And then you tell me, and then I'm going to be the second person knowing that idea, or maybe I'm not going to understand immediately. So it's going to take a while for you to come up with a bridge for me to understand your subjective experience, because you need to make it a little bit more objective so that I can grasp it. So that process of building a bridge between your subjective experience and another person's ability to grasp your subjective experience. Of course, we are in the business of building science, so we're thinking about bridges that turn that into something that is sufficiently non-subjective that we might call something objective, right? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, that experience that you are having, it feels very much like not precise enough in the beginning. It feels almost like art in the beginning. And then you start making it more precise, more precise, more precise. Then eventually the kinds of informations that we can publish in papers are the ones that we get to formulate enough bridges, create bridges of objectivity that it almost feels like objective. Again, I very much do not accept the idea that it's an objective way of approaching reality, but it's sufficiently non-subjective that enough people grasp, there's a critical mass of people that agree with this, that we get to publish our papers, right? So I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I spoke to you about this, so maybe you have seen in my computer, because I have this in my screen of the computer since the time when we were in Rochester. But I have two quotes from one of my favorite philosophers, Bertrand Russell, in my second screen. Let me get you the quotes because I still have it. Let me give you the quotes here because I find it funny. The first one is, everything is vague to a degree you do not realize till you have tried to make it precise.
Yeah, yeah.
And let me tell you the second quote. I do not pretend to start with precise questions. I do not think you can start with anything precise. You have to achieve such precision as you can as you go along. So I always keep these two quotes for me because it's a little bit of a humility check for me to always understand that it's always a dynamic process, right? To go after reality. It's like at any point in time, you need to be aware of the fact that it's never going to be precise enough from the perspective of today, because tomorrow you're going to know a little bit more and you're going to judge your previous self and saying, like, come on, you do not know shit, right? Yeah. So I find it very useful because it gives you, at least in my case, it gives me more curiosity to keep going, because it's really easy for me at a given point to think, wow, I know things, right? I have a new grasp, and now this is good. This is good. It's time for me to write papers, time for me to disseminate information, so on. But oftentimes what happens, in my case, and my claim is that it happens to everybody, is that if you keep going, you will often realize that what you did, even though it might be perhaps more important than what people knew before, but what you didn't know was sufficiently incomplete. Then as you get more information, you're going to realize, wow, that's not precise enough. And again, you have to, at some point, realize that there's going to be a moment you need to publish a paper and you need to get rid of your paper, but you're always going to be this kind of moving target. If you care about reality, if you care about approaching reality, you need to be aware that the way we approach reality is always like a converging point. It's never really, you're never done, right?
Yeah. I think there are two separate points there. One is that if we think of ideas as originating from system one and then work their way into system two, to use the sort of Kahneman taxonomy, that, you know, usually ideas start by you have an intuition that something might be right, and then you investigate your intuition. And so you move, therefore, naturally from system one, from the sort of the fast reaction, into system two, where you try to make things a little bit more concrete and you use rules of abstract logic rather than just intuition. So I think there's maybe an element of that. And then obviously the sort of, you know, what you're talking about at the end there, where your understanding of the world is never fully settled. You know, that's to some extent just reflects that, you know, there's always new information that you're acquiring, and the answers that you get, you know, the information that's available to you is never going to be fully enough to resolve your posterior beliefs to a point mass. So you're always buffeted a little bit by some additional information that comes towards you. And so if you're a sensible person, you continue revisiting your beliefs even after you thought they were pretty settled. So,
yeah. I think this last point you said, I think maybe we could talk about that in the future in another conversation, because it feels to me, so I definitely agree with you about this. I think it's a good model to think about system one and system two about that. If you ask me this 10 years ago, I would say that system one which is exactly what I think most people would consider to have an idea, right?
Yeah.
I would have said that system one is my doing, as in I had an idea. But the more I've been meditating about this, whenever I'm in the process of having an idea, the more I realize that it just, of course, it's a subjective experience I cannot fully convey to you, but it doesn't feel it's my idea, the system one idea. So it does feel more like it's my idea, the system two part, which is once I have an idea, whether I exert enough effort on system two thinking to figure out whether that system one idea holds up, right? So, and that's what leads to a paper eventually, right? But the intuition, the very thought that you might have, some weird connection you might have that you might call an idea, the light bulb idea, it almost like feels like it comes from outside of me. It does not come from inside of me. It's not like something that was really done by me.
It exogenously arrived. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly does not. I've been thinking quite a bit about that. The fact that we keep getting a lot of credit for ideas that we call it ours. I don't know, like at least from the subjective experience perspective that I have, it does not feel like it's my idea. It feels like it could be this standing on the shoulder of giants thing, which is if I have enough experience accumulated with enough papers I've read, enough different weird experiences I have, maybe something connects there. but it does, or maybe it's something more esoteric than that. I do not know. I certainly cannot fully appreciate that at my level of capability of perception. But it does, the system too feels more like my effort, it feels more like, okay, so I had this idea. Does it work? I can go to state and do a simulation. I can do things like that. Mm-hmm. It appears more to be my effort to figure out whether that initial idea holds up. Mm-hmm. I can write to make more formal and stuff like that. But the first idea, it does not feel like it's. I wonder.
I mean, this is speculating way outside of our discipline, but I wonder if that's to do with, basically conscious versus subconscious thought. That essentially, your feeling of what parts of you are to do with the parts of your mental experience which are conscious and draw attention. And so essentially, if you have an idea first and then that sort of, suppose the way that your brain works is that some part of your brain has a thought and then says, hey, give me some help over here, then attention arrives after the idea is already formulated in a sense. And so then if, to the extent that you define your identity in terms of the attention, then maybe the subjective experience is that the idea was already there and then your attention came over to a pre-existing idea. I don't know. I'm very much speculating outside of my domain here.
I think it's a useful model to think about this. But people that, for instance, have done much more meditation than I did, and therefore can perceive things more sharply than I can, they have made statements that, for all intents and purposes, I would consider esoteric statements. Like, for instance, the thoughts do not come from you, or something like that, which I have a hard time making sense of such ideas. So if you were to ask me what is the most reasonable model I have right now, it would be something along the lines of what we call, again, we're compressing words. We're calling conscious and unconscious, things like that, right? We're using models to make sense of the world, this is my current model, but I have seen other people making claims that are more esoteric, and I certainly cannot falsify them. And some of them make statements that they appear to be capable of falsifying. Some of these other claims come from other models, but the problem is that the falsification at the level happens at the subjective level, because they are meditating and they are perceiving something and they realize, oh, that is inconsistent with that other model. But you cannot enter through them to detect the same issue as they are detecting. So it's, again, I have done some videos about the limits of subjective experience in terms of communication because of that, because it's really complicated. But the more I meditate about this, the more open-minded I became about the fact that it's not only complicated, but it's also, it may be real. It's just we cannot be precise enough, in part because we cannot communicate precisely because the instrument of observation is not shared. So
I mean, clearly these are the sorts of claims which bump into questions about, like, how do you define the limits of the self, etc. So if you define the limits of the self in terms of, like, my perception of myself, which is, suppose that's linked to attention, then the idea that the idea came from outside of myself is completely consistent with my model that I had, where the idea is pre-attentional. And then, so in some sense, if I consider my, the things which my mind is doing without my thinking about it as being not me, then that comes from outside of me. And then that raises questions of, like, when I am sitting there not thinking about the location of my tongue in my mouth, is that me who keeps my tongue in that particular location, or is that not me? Is it me who's deciding whether to wiggle my toes a minute ago when I wasn't thinking about what my toes were doing? Is it me who does, when I'm walking around and having a conversation with somebody, I'm not paying attention to what my feet are doing and which muscles are contracting? Is it me contracting those muscles, or is it not me? I don't know. So the notion of self that might be required to justify those claims that people have that the idea is coming from outside of themselves, might be inconsistent with how we might define the self, where we would say, well, that was you who was walking on the ground, and that was you who was holding your
Yeah.
tongue in that particular location in your mouth, etc.
Yeah. I find that everything you're saying is very related to the idea of free will. And
Yes.
I always feel like there's a need, because of there's so much cognitive dissonance there, there's a need for me to attach myself to one of the sides of there is free will or there's no free will. And if I am to be
I think they're
fully
both right.
honest
It just
about
depends
that,
on your definitions. Yeah.
but I think it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of scope for no free will, as in some people are born with a degenerative disease and some people are not, things like that. So it's almost like your choice set is clearly affected by things that I think most people might not call free will. I mean, some people might have more esoteric ideas of karma, things like that, but most people would say, no, there's no free will. Like some people are born with degenerative disease, other people are not. Some people are born in Brazil, others are born in the US. Some people are born in 1900s, some people are born in the 1500s. All those appear to not have been choices that we made ourselves, right? So we are dealt cards that are very different from each other. And I think that part is easier to think that, of course, there's no free will about those things. But there appears to be free will, at least appears to be free will from my perspective. Like I could be speaking this word right now, or I may not be speaking. I could be wiggling my toes, or I may not be wiggling my toes, and things like that. It appears that I have some kind of wiggle room to make decisions that appear to be my decisions here. But then again, over time, the more I meditated about this, I start perceiving things that I would tend to think are my decisions that are not quite my decisions. Of course, as you know, like people in causal inference, I think we have an easier way to think about this, which is probably you are complier to some things in the environment, and there is no free will in that sense, right? Like, for instance, it feels like I work hard and that's why I achieved what I achieved. But it's also possible that I have the right combination of hormones in my body that leads me to recruit the energy that is necessary for me to recruit whenever I need to recruit that energy. And some other people could be identical to me, but may not have the balance of hormones for some weird reason that is not in their control. They may not recruit that energy at the right time. And I label that as I work hard, I exert effort. When in fact, it's just I got lucky in that sense. It's not my free will in that sense. Anyway, these are really
my
hard
take on free will is
decisions.
that essentially, if you define free will as asking, suppose that you change the internal mental state, my internal mental state, would that change something about the world? The answer to that is clearly yes. If you change my internal mental state, there are situations where my budget contains multiple options, and so I make a different choice. And so then different outcomes happen in the real world. So in that sense, I think that is a sense in which you could argue that free will exists if you define free will to encompass that. I think the sense in which free will does not exist is that the internal mental state, I mean, the mind is what brain does. And so if you're asking where does your internal mental state come from? Well, it comes from something. There were initial conditions which were there before your brain even existed, which have resulted in your brain having exactly the configuration that it has, which therefore results in the particular choice that you wind up making. So the choice that you make is determined. Fundamentally, you can think of there as being some causes which are outside of your control, in the sense that there are fundamental causes which I could list which were there before you were born. So I think if you define free will in that way, then you say, well, there's no free will. I think this sort of comes back to the sort of, I know Rubin apparently tells people that you shouldn't ask why questions, because there's more than one answer to a why question. So
Yeah,
why
of
did my
course.
team lose the basketball game by 1 point? Well, it's either because we didn't get that rebound, or because we missed that shot, or because we missed that other shot, or because the guy on the other team made that shot. So, there are a lot of different answers which you can choose, which are all correct answers for why did this occur. And so I think that, is there free will or is it not free will? I think you can reconceptualize that as being an instance of asking a why question. You say, why did this occur? Did this occur because of the person's internal mental state? Yes. Yes, I can argue that if you changed that particular thing, that would have changed the outcome that occurred. On the other hand, can I also fully explain it using a set of things which were not the person's internal mental state? I start with some set of primitive things which occurred before this person even existed. Absolutely, I could explain things that way too. Or, perhaps, I guess, quantum mechanics makes it so that you can't fully predict what's going to happen based on initial conditions. But, let's say through the combination of initial conditions and some element of randomness, which nobody would label as being in the person's control, through that combination of factors, you could also fully explain what happened too. And so I think the question of is there free will or is there not, just sort of depends on which of the definitions you're choosing to describe things.
Yeah, I think it's a nice way of putting it. The still thing that I have now resolved in my understanding of the world about this is about the first part, the change of mental state. It's still not clear to me that this is a choice, or at least that there's something that my unit of consciousness can inherently define as a choice of mine, like how to do it. Like, for instance, I try to live my life by that premise. So as you probably know, since I've been into this since Rochester, it's been over 15 years, I've been thinking quite a bit from the perspective of Stoicism. So I very much believe in the idea that I try to focus on things I can control and not on things I cannot control. And I do live by the premise that I can control my mental state. I do try to live my life as if I have control over my actions, and I'm certainly responsible for my actions on top of it. So that's how I live my life. That's not necessarily my ontology, that's not necessarily my understanding of the real world. The real, is this a good model of the world about how to live your life, or is this reality? As in, is there something happening underneath me in a subconscious level that is actually affecting my mental state? Like, for instance, I have seen sometimes, before I notice those things, I have realized that when I eat food that is sugary, my mental state changes.
Yeah.
So, and that means I'm probably a complier of sugary things. But then you start thinking, okay, so now, was that a decision to eat sugary things or not? Maybe there's something else underneath that scale too, and that keeps going, that I'm compliant to all those things. I honestly do not know, but
I think that fits very neatly with the framework that I was talking about, in the sense that the decisions you're making today are a function of whether you had sugar or not. That's absolutely true. So I could define the outcome of your behavior in terms of, whether you had sugar or not, and other things which, let's say, were externally determined, not from you. But then also, ultimately, after you had sugar, you could have just made a different choice about how to behave. It's not physically impossible for you to have done that. You didn't, because your mental state was one particular thing, but had your mental state been something else, you would have wound up doing something else. And so to me, that, if I define free will in terms of do my actions or do things in the world respond to my mental state at that time, then yes, you still have free will.
But don't
But then
you
you
think
can also say that I don't have free will
exactly,
because my mental state is completely determined by things, which is absolutely a completely true statement too.
Yeah, so let's say that we believe in determinism, right? It's that even though we have no information about how the body works and how the system fully works, it is working in a deterministic way. then it's really hard to believe in free will if we live in a deterministic world, right? Because then there's just it's just something I don't understand, and that's why I tend to label as free will, but that does not mean that it's free will. It reminds a little bit about back in the day how people believed in, I think a lot of still people believe in God, but then something shows up in science that explains it, and then they say, okay, that is not God, but this next thing is still God, or something like that, right? It keeps being
reminds me of
residualized.
Mark Bills. I remember him commenting once about some paper, always bet on the residual.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever label people give to the residual is going to wind up being pretty important looking. So
Yeah.
precisely if you say that there's some difficult to explain aspect of what people are doing, and you call the thing which I wasn't able to predict about what they were able to do, which I, given my limited information about the world, wasn't able to predict, if I call that free will. But if I had full information about the world, there wouldn't be a residual there. So then I would say, well, in principle, if I had full information, then it would seem like there's not free will. And then that's the sort of, that's related to the God in the gaps type thing you're talking about, where like whatever it is that our understanding of the world can't explain, we call that God. That's, bet on the residual, the less you know, especially.
Yeah. So this other point that you're saying, and maybe we should finish here, but this other point you were saying before, that Rubin makes this point that a question of why is sort of ill-posed. And I guess his main point will be that you need to compare to a specific counterfactual, right? So I always do that in my first year. I don't know if you remember my first year PhD class back in Rochester. I do this here all the time.
Your second year PhD class,
yeah. In my first class of the second year PhD.
Okay,
in causal inference, sorry.
Yeah.
I always drop, like I just pretend, imagine if I'm dropping a glass and it shatters in the floor, right? Yeah. Why did it shatter? And most people say, well, because you drop it. But wait, if I was dropping in space, it wouldn't shatter.
Yeah.
Yes. If I was dropping and the floor was softer than the glass, it wouldn't shatter.
Yeah.
If I dropped it and it was not an actual glass, it was plastic, it wouldn't shatter. So it depends on the counterfactual, right? So you could say that the reason why it shattered was because I dropped. The reason why it shattered is because of gravity. It could be because it's glass, or because the floor is harder than the glass. And I guess we can keep going, right? But the key point here is that there are lots of different answers to that question of why, and it depends on the counterfactual that you have in mind. You don't remember this in my first?
I don't remember this at all. No.
Or maybe I start having this example later.
Might well be.
Yeah. But anyway, I think this relates a lot to the idea to get more epistemic humility about even like there are different ways of thinking about the same question of why, right?
Yeah.
Which is helpful. Anyway, it was great talking to you as always.
Yeah. Great talking
to you, man.